This is a Sports Catastrophe production. Hey there, Heather Ho there. It's Jeff Cutter Diamond. Happy Canada Day to my Canadian brethren, and this is another on this day that happened on Canadian soil. I couldn't find source material for 1967. I found out about Bobby Unser winning a car race on Canada's Centennial, but I couldn't find any stuff on the net about it. So practically, I have had to change it up, and I found this thing. It was official. It was something that, you know, things are as they seem to be. But the fact of the matter is that it happened. This Canada Day would be a bad Canada Day for those. This happened in 1996, a year before the famous Blue Jays Expos game of 97, which I covered a couple years ago. But the fact of the matter was that it was true. Canada was now down to 6 NHL teams, as the Winnipeg Jets were officially going to Arizona. Although, it was speculated, it was official. So anyway, let's take a look at um, Canada's history with NHL teams and all that. So Canada practically ran the NHL for franchises from 1917 to 1924. You had teams in Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa were the big three. But Quebec joined for a while, and then they moved to Hamilton until 1924 when Boston was given a franchise, making them the first American NHL team. Montreal got a second team in the Maroons. But anyway, the Canadian teams were stabilized. That Toronto nearly moved to Philadelphia in 1927, but thanks to Conn Smythe's efforts, the team stayed in Toronto and became the Maple Leafs franchise we all know, and kind of like, depending on your point of view. Montreal was actually unstable. There were rumors circulating Montreal would move in the 30s to Cleveland, but fortunately, businessmen saved that team. Ottawa, rumors were circulating of relocating for years, and they did. In 1934, they would relocate to St. Louis to become the Eagles, but that franchise folded within 1 year. The Montreal Maroons would stay alive until 1938, but then instead of moving, they were actually put on the inactive list, but then they were never activated. So that franchise folded. And Quebec wouldn't have another team for years. So for Canada, it was only Toronto and Montreal within the boundaries of the original 6, with Chicago, New York, Detroit, and Boston being the American teams. In 1967, the NHL would expand by 6 teams, but shockingly, they decided not to expand to Canada. Vancouver was the best bet for Canada to get a third franchise, but no, they didn't. They ended up moving to Philly, Pittsburgh, Oakland, Los Angeles, St. Louis, and Minnesota. But Canada got a team in 1970 by hook or by crook, by expansion teams, because the Seals were doing so badly and almost moved to Vancouver. The NHL decided to expand to Buffalo and Vancouver, so Canada got a third NHL team. That was the consensus, was 3 Canadian teams until 1979 when the WHA did a major move and decided to do something big. They decided to merge, meaning that of the 4 franchises, only one was with New England / Hartford Whalers would be American. The other 3 would be Canadian. So Canada would double in size by NHL teams. They had Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, but they would move. They would have Edmonton, Winnipeg, and Quebec City. Now, there was a vote early in 1979, and it failed. And there were rumors circulating, well, what franchises had this feeling. But it was actually said that Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver were against the merger for many reasons. Toronto, because Harold Ballard didn't like the WHA. Montreal, because they didn't want Quebec City to be in the league, because, Montreal wanted the Quebec rights to themselves. and Vancouver because of the TV rights, I suppose. Yeah, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver didn't want to move, didn't want another team to come to Canada because of the TV rights. They didn't want to share their broadcasting rights. However, it was noted that Vancouver was supposed to vote yes on the merger, but the guy but the guy who was Frank Griffith's right hand man, the owner of the Canucks, actually voted no. When Griffiths found out, he fired him, even though he was one of his truest friends. He fired him. There was a second vote, and yes, it passed. So Canada would get 3 more franchises: Quebec City, Edmonton, and Winnipeg. For Quebec City, they would be keeping their franchise cool and have a great provincial rivalry with Montreal, but the Canadian dollar was just slumping in the mid-90s. Quebec couldn't compete with the bigger salaries and all that. Salaries changing from American to Canadian dollars just didn't work, and people didn't want to go to Canada because of the taxes. So anyway, regardless of that, Quebec lost their franchise to Colorado because of small Canadian dollar, despite the fact that the Nordiques could have went on a Stanley Cup run and maybe they would not have been sold to Colorado. Because why would you win a championship and then you move to another city? But yeah, that's what happened. Colorado won the Cup in 96, proving that Quebec could have had the Cup in 96. Edmonton has had a few bumps in the road with management, like Peter Pocklington and a few other things. There were rumors circulating in the mid-90s that Edmonton was going to move to Houston to become the Houston Oilers. Get the pun if you're an NFL fan. However, that did not come to be, and Edmonton thankfully stays in Edmonton. And as of this taping, they are the last Canadian team to be in the Stanley Cup Finals, although they did lose in 7 to Florida. And yes, I did pick against Edmonton, but that wasn't because of national pride. It was because you got to pick the best team possible, and I did. And let's not forget the other team, Winnipeg. Well, let's also add the fact that, Ottawa came crawling for an NHL team too. And so did Calgary. We forgot about Ottawa and Calgary. I know. Calgary moved from, Atlanta, the Atlanta Flames were not sustainable and moved from Atlanta to Calgary, became the Calgary Flames, and within a decade won a Stanley Cup. Calgary plays in the Saddle Dome, which is kind of antiquated and all that. They won a new arena. And Ottawa. Ottawa getting an expansion team for the 92-93 season, beating the Montreal Canadiens on day 1. But the Senators just falling off a cliff in that 93 season. They got the number 1 draft pick by basically tanking the last few games, but it bit them in the butt as Alex Stagg was a bust. Ottawa would not be sustainable until 1997. But regardless, let's talk about Winnipeg. Now, the Jets were a very good franchise. They were in the WHA. They were one of the most successful WHA franchises around. I mean, they won 3 WHA championships, including the final WHA game ever against Edmonton. Yeah, when Bobby Hall, Alf Nielsen, and Lars Erik Schulberg paved the way. Then in the NHL, they had trouble. So Winnipeg would take years to get better. At one point, they even had a 30-game a winless streak. And they had a 9-win season in 1981. The Jets would be much better in a sense. And in 1985 and 87, they beat the Calgary Flames in the playoffs, but then would lose both years to Edmonton. Little did people know those were the only 2 times the Jets won a playoff series as the Winnipeg Jets. Winnipeg would be known for choking 3-1 leads a couple of times. In 1990, they were up 3-1 on the soon-to-be Stanley Cup champion Edmonton Oilers. Dave Ellett had scored in double overtime, and the Jets were looking good. All they needed was 1 win. They couldn't get it for some reason. Bill Ranford just played his heart out, and the Oilers won the Stanley Cup that year. In 92, they were up 3-1 on the Vancouver Canucks. They were looking pretty good against them. But again, they choked to the Canucks. So the Jets just couldn't believe their luck. They were known as choke artists and all that. They had Teemu Selanne. They had a good young core. But in 96, they traded Teemu to Anaheim for Temple Newman. No, not Temple Newman. Oleg Tverdovsky. They were just giving up. Despite all that, Winnipeg snuck into the playoffs as the 8th seed ahead of Anaheim. Would face the Detroit Red Wings, who were that damn good. They had 62 wins in that 96 season, which set the NHL record at the time. The Jets actually pulled off a couple key wins in games 3 and 5, but unfortunately lost game 6 on home ice against Detroit, and it was basically Winnipeg's final farewell to the league. It was almost certain that the Jets were going to move. And on July 1st, 1986, it was official, on Canada's birthday, no less. They would move to Phoenix, become the Coyotes, who basically, it's time to kind of rant. And the rant is that Gary Bettman would not let hockey die in Phoenix, despite the fact that the Coyotes could be more viable in Kansas City or Vegas at the time, or Seattle at that time. Or heck, even bring it to Canada. Bring it to Hamilton, bring it to maybe Toronto again, maybe Southern Ontario. But no, Bettman would not let the dream die. And that's kind of why the Coyotes just weren't viable. They had issues in the state of Arizona moving within the state of Arizona. Heck, they played in a 5,000-seat college hockey arena for the past few years as the Arizona Coyotes. Like 5,000 seats. Can you imagine that? By comparison, my hometown Kitchener Rangers of the OHL, our rink's like 6,000 seats and we can sell that quickly. But the fact of the matter is that, the Coyotes are not in Phoenix anymore. They're not in Arizona. As of this taping, they're now in Utah. And for 1 year, they'll be the Utah Hockey Club, and then they'll change their name. Probably the Utah Grizzlies, by my guess. But yeah, the Coyotes went into Phoenix, bringing hockey to Southwest United States. The Coyotes would also be known for choking 3-1 leads. In 1999, against the Blues, they choked the 3-1 series lead. They did take the whiteout, and fans did take the whiteout to heart, which is okay. But Arizona, really? Yeah, you want to expand hockey and all that, but to a climate that almost hits 100 Fahrenheit every day, it just didn't work. Like, what the puck? Sorry for the pun, it just had to happen. Anyhow, I'm Jeff, I'm going to do.